Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Brian Hennegan and I'm a member of the Hurricane Restoration team. As you walk around the museum, you will see that most of the exhibits, in one way or another, will tell the story of Brooklands. And of course, the hurricane behind me is very much a story of Brooklands. I want to tell you a little bit about the hurricane first of all. Now, the hurricane, as I said, is a very, very important aeroplane. It is a very significant part to our cultural history. The Battle of Britain, for example, and I'll talk about that in a few moments. The Hurricane is a very, very significant aeroplane and plays a very significant part in the development of the Hawker aeroplane. Let me take you for a walk around the front of the aeroplane. Firstly, let's talk about the armaments of the aeroplane. The aeroplane has got 8 guns. It's got 4 guns in that wing and 4 guns in the other wing. These guns, in fact, are Browning 303s. Now, you may not be aware, but the pilot in the Hurricane and in the Spitfire had 15 seconds worth of ammunition. 15 seconds. I'll tell you how that works out. So there are 8 guns and they're Browning 303s. Now, the Browning 303 fired 1,200 rounds a minute. Each of those guns was loaded with 300 rounds. So you can see 300 being exactly a quarter of the 1,200. The guns would be synchronised in the firing butts on the airfield. And they would be synchronised so that roughly 200 yards in front of the aeroplane, all the guns came together. If you were a Polish pilot, of course, and I'm sure I can mention this without any comeback at all, if you were a Polish pilot, you'd signify your guns to be about 100 yards because the Poles were very angry people and they didn't want to miss what they were firing at. The pilot obviously would fire in small bursts, 3 seconds, brrr, 2 seconds, brrr, or it may be that he would not fire if he hadn't got anything in his sights. So this meant that otherwise the bullets would be wasted. But we all know it worked out very, very well. Let me talk about the Battle of Britain because I know you're all waiting to hear about this. There were 2 aeroplanes that come to light in history as far as the battle was concerned. That is the Hurricane and the Spitfire. But do remember this, at the time of the battle, the Hurricane shot down more enemy aircraft than all the other Allied aircraft and ground offensive put together. A good reason for this, of course, there were more Hurricanes than Spitfires. I was very fortunate, I don't know, 3-4 years ago, maybe more, time flies, I had lunch up in the checkered flag room with a chap called Dennis David, Air Commodore Dennis David. Now, he flew both the Hurricane and he flew the Spitfire. And he said to me, Brian, I do detest this argument about which aeroplane is the better. I can tell you, he said, without any contradiction, if we'd have only had Hurricanes, we'd have lost the Battle of Britain. If we'd have only had Spitfires, we'd have lost the Battle of Britain. It worked out this way. The Hurricane, if you look at the wing, it's a fairly thick profile, which means it's a very stable gun platform. The Hurricane tended to go for the low-flying aircraft, i.e. the bombers, and the Spitfire went for the high cover, 30,000 feet, 28,000 feet. There was nothing much in the performance of the two aeroplanes. The Hurricane, in fact, could outturn an Me-109. It had that tight turning circle. Let's have another look along the front here and see a bit more about this very significant aeroplane. This propeller has got 3 blades. When did this aeroplane first fly? Well, it flew from Brooklands on the 6th of November 1935. The aeroplanes had been constructed in Langley Road at Kingston-on-Thames, and then they came over to Brooklands to the hangars roughly where Tesco's and Marks and Spencer's is now, and then the aeroplane was finally assembled. And on the 6th of November 1935, the Hurricane lifted up for the first time. So you will see that in a very few days' time from now, when this is being filmed, we celebrate the 90th anniversary of the aeroplane. Let me tell you another difference between the Hurricane and the Spitfire, and it was fairly significant. If you look at the undercarriage of the Hurricane, you will see that the wheels rotate up into the aeroplane from the outside to the inside, which means that in between those 2 tyres you've got 7 feet 1.5 inches, which means it's very, very stable. The Spitfire, on the other hand, had an undercarriage which went from the centre of the aeroplane and folded up to the outside. And that meant the wheels were much closer together. Well, so what, I hear you say. But what we must remember is at the time of the Battle of Britain, and indeed for some time afterwards, the airfields were very, very rough affairs. The ministry had purloined farmers' ground, they torn up the hedges, they filled in the ditches, and they tried to roll it as best they could. Which meant, of course, that the airfields were very far from smooth. Nothing like the bowling green that you get when you've got a hard runway. That meant that the Hurricane was very much on its own. It could taxi and prepare for takeoff without the need for a wingman hanging on to one of the wingtips. The Spitfire, of course, needed one of the ground crew to support the wings so that they could be stopped from maybe hitting the ground. I suppose that the next important thing we ought to consider is the power plant of this aeroplane. And of course, as most of you will know, it's got the fabulous Rolls-Royce Merlin. It's a V12, 6 cylinders down each side. Very, very powerful, ran at about 1,200 RPM and also produced about 1,200 horsepower. The same engines, of course, went into the Spitfire, although, of course, later on the Spitfire was fitted with the Griffin engine, which the Hurricane never was. The lights we have here, you can see they're the navigation, they are the landing lights. And on the far tips, you've got the coloured lights, you've got the red for the port and green for the starboard. This funny little box here in front of me is a camera. And when the guns are fired, a photograph is taken. So when they get back to the airfield and the intelligence officer wants to start looking at what has happened, that will be of a great assistance to him. Let me just go back to the guns just for another few moments. You'll observe that they're covered up with a red tape. And the aeroplanes were like that when they went into combat. Now that tape served 4 purposes. The first purpose, of course, was to keep out the grass and the verdigris that was coming up from the airfield, being sucked up by the prop. The second one, it would not interfere with the airflow, so this very substantial Hawker wing would not be impaired by having the hole openings there. The next one, of course, is to try and keep the guns warm. When you're flying at 22,000 feet, it might be a midsummer's day back on land, but when you get up to 22,000 feet, it's beginning to get a little bit chilly. There is a bleed that comes off of the engine to keep them warm, but it wasn't all that effective. Wasn't all that effective. Now, until about 2 years ago, I learnt what the fourth reason was. I was very fortunate, as indeed we all are, to have conversations with Battle of Britain pilots and their ground crew. Alas, of course, they've all gone now, they've all passed away. But I was talking to a group here one day, and when I'd finished, a gentleman came up to me and said, "Brian," he said, "can I give you a fourth reason for this canvas covering?" I said, "Of course you can." And he said, "Well, I was a member of the ground crew." I thought, well, here's a man that knows. Keep these open, keep this closed. And he told me, he said, well, when the aeroplanes come back from combat, we're all very keen to see how our skipper has done, and indeed if our skipper is coming back. The other thing it does, I was an armourer, and I expect to see 8 holes punched in those canvas covers. If you watch on a Sunday afternoon, maybe an old war film about an air battle, you'll see black and white footage has been interspersed, and you'll see when the guns fire, you'll see this fabric flapping. And that is the bullets, of course, going through the canvas. Right, well, there we are. I think at the moment we've got almost as far as we can on this from the front of the aeroplane. What I'd like to do is now to take you to the back of the aeroplane, because, of course, that is extremely significant. Okay, so if you'd like to come with me, come round the back of the aeroplane. Don't bump your head on the wingtips as you go round. Here we are, we're just going round in front of the Hawker Hunter, another aircraft of Sidney Cam's. And it was Sidney Cam, of course, who designed the Hurricane and many other Hawker airplanes to follow. Let's look at the back of the aeroplane. Now, you will notice you can hear the drum. That is Irish linen, which has been stretched over the frame. And you can see the mark of the stringers running along here, making these lines. Now, that was covered with 7 coats of dope, which is a fluid to contract the Irish linen. Then on top of that, you had the different camouflage arrangements, the roundels and the aeroplane's squadron number and squadron aircraft. The tailplane here, a very, very substantial piece of kit. This is metal. On the front here, and everything else is fabric covered. The same with the rudder. I mentioned earlier on about the difference between the Hurricane and the Spitfire. Well, of course, the Spitfire was designed by Supermarine, but to give it its proper title, it is the Vickers Supermarine Spitfire. And for some of us, that's very, very important. The Spitfire was what they call monocoque construction. This wasn't fabric, it was all metal at the back. But Hawkers very wisely did what they did do well. They'd been building aeroplanes in this manner for a number of years. And of course, thank goodness they continued, because at the time of the Battle of Britain, there were twice as many Hurricanes as there were Spitfires, which of course made a significant difference when it came to the Battle of Britain. The front of the aeroplane, obviously, the fuselage is all metal. You can see the metal cover there. The canopy and the cockpit, which is known as the dog kennel, was made out of timber, and the fabric was put across the timber. If you imagine a pylon standing up on end, a short pylon, that would be what the fuselage of the aeroplane looks like, of course lying down. Onto that there are wooden formers which are cut very, very precision to size, and then the stringers and the other bits and pieces were put on. I won't bore you with the details of putting on the fabric, but that again is quite interesting. At the back of the aeroplane here, of course, you've got control surfaces. These are the ailerons. These are the controls which makes the aeroplane bank from left to right. This one on this side would go up and the other one would go down, or vice versa. And of course these were fabric covered, and they always were fabric covered. The early aeroplane, of course, had fabric covered wings, but by the time they built 430 of them, they reverted to metal wings, which improved performance quite considerably. So what I want to do is now tell you about the restoration, and particularly about our aeroplane here, Z2389. This has had a very interesting history. It first flew on the 30th of October 1940, so you can see it just missed the Battle of Britain, because it went to a maintenance unit and then Rolls-Royce had it back to do some work on the engine of experimental nature. The aeroplane, of course, eventually finished up flying for a number of RAF squadrons. In fact, it was about 10 in all. But the one I want to talk to you today, which is significant, if you look at that engine cowling there, you will see ES, and that ES stands for Eagle Squadron. Now that was an American squadron. Before the Americans joined the war, there were a whole load of Americans came over to fight on behalf of the Allies, and they had 3 squadrons. If you look on this side, you will see an eagle with boxing gloves. Now that is very much a Walt Disney type of character. And we have it on good authority, although I've never substantiated it, that Walt Disney designed that motif. And if you go to America now and you see the aeroplanes taking off from the aircraft carriers, those of the squadron will still have that motif, which goes right the way back to the time of the Battle of Britain. Now, you may remember from your history, or you may not. I only remember, of course, because I swatted up about it. You may have heard of Operation Barbarossa. Now, at that time, the Russians, of course, were very much our allies, and they were having a very difficult time of life. And just as an aside, the Russians lost thousands and thousands of people during the battles. Churchill wanted to give Stalin a boost. So what he did, he arranged for 3,000 Hurricanes to be sent out to Russia. And ours was one of them. They went out on those Russian convoys just as a matter of Information, useless or otherwise, our aeroplane went out on a boat called the Empire Baffin, and it was part of the PQ-16 convoy setup. Unfortunately, of course, a lot of the aeroplanes never arrived. A lot of the boats were sunk, and a lot of seamen lost their lives. Very, very, very poignant position and a place in our history. But our aeroplane was fortunate, if I can use that phrase. It went out and was flown by Russian pilots. Well, one day, our aeroplane was flown by a man called Ivan Kalashnikov. That's got nothing to do with the rifles. I'm reliably informed that that frequency is rather like the frequency of Johnson in this country. I only know that because I had a Russian lady working for me at one time, and of course we discussed this period in quite big detail and quite long detail. Now, poor Ivan got himself into a skirmish with some Me-109s, and very, very unfortunately, a bullet came up from the rear of the aeroplane at a very shallow angle on the starboard side, this right-hand wing here. It entered the back of the cockpit and it missed the armour plate that was behind Ivan, and it smashed his shoulder. And of course, that makes it very difficult to fly, especially when you've got other people out there trying to kill you. But he stuck with the aeroplane, and he stuck it down on the tundra to the north of Murmansk. They were flying from an airfield called Vanga. He made his way back to the unit, and we do know that he survived the battle. But we don't really know much about him. We've been trying to go through the various embassies a long time ago, this is, but we've had no luck. So poor Ivan has now become just a name in history. Well, what happened? The aeroplane was put down in a false landing. So to say it was slightly bent might have been an exaggeration. But the aeroplane lay there for 50 years. Until the Russians moved it back into a hangar, because they realised that there was now money to be made by these aeroplanes if they could be reassembled and sold. Well, luckily for us, the Russians didn't get very far. And to cut a long story short, a chap by the name of Julian Temple, who used to be the curator here, went out to Russia with a chap called Bob Coles, and had a look at the aeroplane, and it was agreed that yes, it was doable. So the aeroplane was eventually crated up after all the reams of documentation to get import licenses and things such as that. And the young lady who worked with me, incidentally, did a lot of the translation for us, so we're very grateful to Tatiana. But that's an aside. The aeroplane arrived back here in 1998, and it was put into the acoustic building, which is where they've got the Concorde simulator at the moment. We didn't start work on it straight away because we were applying for a grant from the lottery, and in order to get that, you had not to have started the project. So that was why it lay there for some little time, for about a couple of years. Then later on, it came to the daylight, and it came back into the acoustic building, and we started to reassemble the aeroplane there. The man who was put in charge was Roy Lomax, and Roy and his wife Hilary played a very significant part in the development of the museum. They came back here right in the 80s, and British Aerospace at the time was still in the building. So a team was got together, of which I was one of them, and we started to build the aeroplane, looking obviously at the fuselage first. The fuselage could have presented us with a problem, but what we wanted to do was to see whether or not, let me just step over this wire here, whether or not we could make new tubes from round into square. The joints on this aeroplane, as indeed many of the Hawker aeroplanes, was very, very similar. What you have, without going into too many technical details, is you have two stainless steel plates, one on each side. And on the outside here, you have two metal ferrules. And in between, you've got a spacing bar. Are you still with me? I'm trying to keep up. The bolt goes through and they're done up. It was a little bit more involved than that. But again, we did prove that we could square the tubes off without using sophisticated equipment. Incidentally, these plates are made of stainless steel. And when you go back to the fuselage, right the way down the end, at every joint, you will see these stainless steel plates. And when we clean them all up, you can see the part number and the inspector's stamp. We did have to make about 20 plates to replace those that had been bent, damaged, or could not be used. So there we are. That is how the fuselage was put together. The engine is held up on these engine bearers, and what you have is a strengthening unit here, because this part here is going to take the full weight of the Merlin engine. And I understand that on the airfields during the Battle of Britain, for example, the ground crew would whip one of these out and put another one back in 4 hours. It takes me longer than that to change the oil on my motorbike, but there we are. That is life. You can see the exhaust pipes up there, 6 on each side. Some of the exhaust pipes were different. You had what they call Siamese pipes, which means you have one pipe with 3 double exits together. So we were very, very lucky, all the people who helped us. We didn't do it on our own, of course. We had help from many, many companies in the area, and many of them became very enthusiastic. They would make bits up for us that needed machining. They would make up bits that had to go under a milling machine or on a lathe. We also had help from the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, because we had items from there. Incidentally, the aeroplane was always going to be a non-flying aeroplane. So Battle of Britain were quite happy to sign off the parts, because they would not have been suitable or indeed legal to be put on a flying aeroplane. I've already mentioned to you about the undercarriage, and that was the same all the way through the production. In the centre there, you've got a radiator, and in the middle you've got an oil cooler. The round oil cooler in the middle there, you might find it difficult to see, but rest assured it is there. And this aperture here was for the carburetors. There were 2 SU carbs, big ones, driving the engine. Right, let's move over to the wings. Now, obviously, wings are a very important part of the aeroplane for obvious reasons. If you look up on the wall behind you here, you will see a short section of wing as it came back from Russia. Now, that is really what most of the wing looked like. We've kept that piece because we've outlined the red star. You can just make out the red star, which was the insignia of the Russian Air Force. And we put the strong band round it so that you could make it easier to see. So you can see that they were a no-no. So the wings had to be completely rebuilt. We did use some of the original pieces. There's two main spars on the wing, which come out roughly to about here. And the ones that we had were slightly bent, not a lot, but as it wasn't going to be a flying aircraft, we were able to put them under the press and straighten them out. And it's little jobs like this that took a long time. I'm telling you this in a few words, but you've got to multiply that maybe 4, 5, 6 weeks to get to where we were. The wings join up here. These strips, under those strips is a join, and the wings are bolted on there and then bolted onto the spar which comes out from the centre here. All this had to be made up from scratch. If you do get time when you're going round the museum and you come to the Hurricane, if you look on the wall as you come in the door to your left hand side, there are photographs there. And it says Resurrecting Z2389, and there are 1 or 2 interesting photographs. I said we started to build the aeroplane in the acoustic building, but of course, rather like building a boat in the back garden at home, you find that you've got too much boat for too small garden and a house in the way. But we thought about this. What we had to do was get the fuselage out of the acoustic building and get it into the hangar. And we got this into the hangar so that we could continue rebuilding the aeroplane. We actually started work on the aeroplane in 1999, and we had the topping out ceremony 20 years later. So you can see it wasn't a 5-minute airfix job on the dining room table. But there we are, that's what it's all about. It makes life happy, and as my wife says, it keeps me off the streets and gets me away from underneath her feet. God bless her. Once again, thanks very much indeed, and it's been a pleasure talking to you. Bye-bye.